Have you popped that big question yet? Maybe you've done it multiple times, or maybe you're too scared to ask. 3 explosive words. Who am I? It's kept a few thinkers in business for millennia, and to this day, identity remains core business for people like Patrick Stokes, who tries to put together the pieces. Here he is from a great presentation he gave on personal identity at the Ethics Centre in Sydney. And I do hope you like thought experiments. Oh, and you're in the Philosopher's Zone.
Philosophers have a really unfortunate habit of working in highly improbable thought experiments. So I'm going to unapologetically open this with a really ridiculous, impossible thought experiment to get you starting to think through these issues about identity and personal identity. Imagine that you have a complete list of every fact about the universe. Every fact about every star, every planet, every proton, every neutron, every cat, every dog, every house, every piece of information there is to know about the entire universe. Right? It's going to be fairly big, but you've got it there. And this, of course, includes, therefore, every fact about every person, whoever has lived or ever will live. Their name, their place of birth, their place of death, what they had for breakfast on the 4th of March, every piece of information is going to be in there. There's one simple question to ask yourself. Which one of all those people listed in there is you? And you might think, well, that's fairly straightforward. I'll just look my name up. Presumably this thing is searchable. Oh, okay, there you go. You found all the stuff about you, right? You found your entry. But what I'm asking is, what makes you the person actually reading through the list? That person that's listed there. You've got a set of facts about a person. But what is it that makes you the subjective person looking at that list, the person that's listed in that book? It seems like I can give a complete description of the universe, including all the people in it, without ever including the fact, and that particular one there is me. What is the relationship of me as a subjective first-person perspective with that objective person who's listed there? Right. This is stolen from Thomas Nagel, contemporary American philosopher, who says, okay, it looks like if we had such an inventory, it seems like which one of those people is me is a fact that we care about that we can't find in our list, right? You can't find it because the list is a completely third-personal inventory of the universe. It's a completely objective list. There's no place in that list for first-personal. So it seems like we can describe the whole universe without actually describing first persons, without bringing me or I into it. And in the same way, it seems like we can describe persons without saying which one of those persons is me or I, or which one is me and which one is you. So it seems like a completely third-personal, objective account of the universe, such as science favours, for instance, isn't going to tell us which one of those people is me or you. It has no room in that universe for first-person perspectives. But, as Lynn Rudder Baker, another contemporary American philosopher, has noted, nothing makes as much difference to the universe as the existence of first-person perspectives, at least for us. Right? The only reason the sky appears blue is because we have a subjective experience of light waves. Right? You can give an objective account of light waves hitting the retina and then being transported through the brain and turned into a set of impulses, but the bluishness of blue, the subjective bluishness of blue, what philosophers in our more pretentious moments like to call the qualia of bluishness, that won't appear in a completely objective description of the universe. And what we care about, how we live our lives, the things we're afraid of, the things we look forward to, our whole motivational structures are all built around being first-person perspectives, which just disappear when you look at the world third-personally. Okay. So it seems like we have this concern that's built around what we tend to call selves or persons, by which we don't just mean, or typically don't just mean, individual human animals that have names and live in particular locations and have particular histories, but the thing that we experience ourselves as being. And philosophers, because we can't agree on anything to save ourselves, have radically different accounts of what these selves are, if indeed they exist at all. 400 years ago, in a chapter that he would only allow to be published after he died, I think, John Locke pretty much reinitiated the entire modern discussion of personal identity in a chapter called Identity and Diversity in his essay concerning human understanding, in which he basically made selves, if you like, a kind of centerpiece of our moral and agental lives. Other philosophers have denied that there's any such thing. Most famously, the Buddha. Buddhism is built around a denial of the idea that there is anything called the self and that our sense of self is a mere illusion and that ditching that illusion will make us considerably happier. That's kind of the back of the cornflakes packet version of Buddhism, and obviously there's a huge diversity of Buddhisms, if you like, but nonetheless, the anatta doctrine, the doctrine of no self, is a key part of Buddhist thought. David Hume, Scottish philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, which was in a remarkably productive period in Scottish intellectual life in the 18th century. Hume says, when I introspect, that is, he says, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure, but I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. Question for you. What's the first thing you remember? Go back, think, just spend a bit of time there. What's the earliest memory you have? It could be really vague, it could be really detailed and defined. My earliest memory is we went on holiday to Narooma, and I remember looking through a glass door, and I have a vague sense that I'd never seen a glass door before, but I remember looking out at the sea, and that's the earliest kind of visual memory I have. From a couple of years later, I have a slightly stronger memory, which is that I was 4 years old and I went fishing with my dad on a pier at Phillip Island, just south of Melbourne. And Dad wasn't looking and I did something silly and I fell into the water. And Dad looked up and I wasn't there. And then he sees my hand just appear out of the water. He just went and grabbed me and pulled me out. And the only two little bits of episodic memory I have of that are after being pulled out. I remember wearing one of those Made in Australia jumpers, you know, with that logo on it that was like thick wool and it was sopping wet. And I remember being taken down the pier and somebody commiserating. But I also have just this tiny little flashbulb memory of being maybe 2 feet away from the pier wall and I just can see the blurry green and the bubbles. And I can still see that really, really clearly. Now here's the question. What makes that me? What's the connection between the 39-year-old guy who talks too much and the 4-year-old who couldn't keep his balance on a pier? Now you might say, well, because you have a visual recording of that event in your head. And you couldn't have that visual recording in your head if it wasn't you. Here's an interesting thing about visual recordings though. When I asked earlier how many of you, what your first memory was, how many of you, for your first memory, you can see yourself in that memory? There's a few of you? Yep, there's a few people nodding here. Cool. Now that's called observer memory, right? If memory was just like a video camera in your head, that would be impossible. Obviously, you can't see yourself from the outside like that. And yet something like 20-25% of episodic memory is observer memory. They're actually surprisingly common. So the question is, okay, you're now remembering some very old memory, because I've asked you to. What is it that makes the person figured in that memory, either whether you can see them or whether it's the eye line that that memory is shot from, so to speak, what is it that makes them you? What links you to that person? Or to give you some pretentious language you can use afterwards, from courtesy of J. David Velleman, what links the notional and actual subjects of this particular instance of imagined seeing? Lots of different answers. This being philosophy, none of them turn out to be perfect. They all do some good jobs of answering to some of our intuitions, they all fall short on others. Is it the same body? Do I have the same body as that little kid that fell off the pier? Well, it depends how you define body, right? There's a lot more of me than there was then, and not just because there's been a few cheeseburgers between now and then, but also because your body changes cells every few years. I mean, there's different answers on this. One figure is you change most of the cells in your body every 7 years or so. There are some you keep pretty much the whole way through. But on the atomic level, you're actually regenerating, I think it's something like every 3 weeks or so, right? So in terms of what makes you the same body, We're going to have to tell, at best, a very complicated story about bodily continuity. Is it that you have the same soul? We'll see shortly that souls actually are initially a pretty promising candidate for some of this stuff, but they're kind of impossible to prove they exist, and as you'll see, they also don't do all the work we want them to do. Is it the sheer fact of memory? As we'll see, there's problems with memory accounts of personal identity. Is it the fact that I have the same mind as that kid that fell off the pier? What does that mean, having the same mind? How do you count minds? But of course, it's not just a mere academic problem, right? Philosophers can turn it into a mere academic problem for you. Don't worry. If you want us to turn this into a bland, merely kind of abstract issue, we can certainly do that for you, no problem. But it is, in fact, a problem that connects with things that we care about very fundamentally. Who we are, where we're going, what we can and can't survive, what we are and aren't responsible for, what relationship we bear to our past and future. For early Christian theologians, this was life or death stuff. Literally, well, life beyond death stuff, right? So in the early days of Christianity, they're just trying to work out what this theology that they've got means, how it all works. One of the things they've been promised is bodily resurrection. We tend to forget that. We tend to think that the Abrahamic faiths and Christianity in particular say that when you die, your soul flies up to heaven. But in fact, the early theology on this was that you were raised in a bodily form. Okay, but you kind of fall apart a bit after you die, so how's that going to work? Oh, that's okay, God just puts your body back together and up you come. Okay, but what if I've been eaten by animals? As happens, what if I've been fed to the lions? You know, if the lions eat me, then my body becomes part of the lion's body. What's going to happen then on the day of judgment? Oh, that's easy enough. God will take some matter from the lion and give it back to you, right? So you'll be raised that way in the same body. Ah, but what if I've been eaten by a cannibal? Then my body has become part of the body of the cannibal. We share matter. So how's that going to work on the day of resurrection? Is God going to split it in two so we each get like half a leg or something? Jewish theologians in the Middle Ages faced a similar kind of question about bodily resurrection. Their answer was to posit that there's one bone in the spine that is indestructible, which they called the luz. And the idea was, or the nut of the spine. The idea was that the luz, you could hit it with a hammer, the hammer would just glance off. You could throw it in the fire, it'd come out untouched, right? And the idea was that that's what you'd be rebuilt around. So as long as you had the same luz, you were the same person. Then they found the Greek idea of souls. And they worked out, okay, souls do a lot of the work we want here, right? Because we can, it doesn't matter so much which body you get if you're not your body. If you're not, and Paul sometimes thinks of us as minded bodies in a way, or what we would today call minded bodies, but then later theologians start to think of us as souls and say you are essentially your soul, right? Building on a Greek conception. What's a soul? Well, as it comes to be understood by the rationalists, a thinking immaterial substance. So a substance that is a self-enduring thing, but it's not made of matter. Because it's not made of matter, it can't be divided. Because it can't be divided, it can't decay. Because it can't decay, it's immortal. Right? That was the rationalist proof of immortality, if you like. And in a way, that maps neatly onto a sense we often have that we're not our bodies. Sometimes we talk about our bodies as this alien thing. And of course, this gets around all these bodily problems around the nature of resurrection. But souls actually won't help terribly much. If you have a liver transplant, we wouldn't say that your identity has changed, right? We wouldn't say that you are the person whose liver you received, right? You're you've just got a new liver. What if you got a soul transplant? Now, some religions, as I say, some forms of Christianity, Hinduism, might say that, well, yes, you would be a different person in that case because your soul is who you are. That's your essence, your personhood. Think about something really embarrassing you did when you were young. Maybe even something a bit morally iffy you might have done when you were young. And I'm not going to give you an example of one of mine. But thinking back to that, are you now fully responsible as you were then? We may even be a little bit inconsistent about this, right? So if somebody does something fairly minor when they're young, we might write that off and say, oh, well, you're a kid, whatever. Whereas, yeah, we still try Nazi war criminals for things they did when they were maybe 18 or 19. So, yeah, maybe the magnitude of the event matters here. Maria Scheckman has a really interesting discussion of this where she imagines the figure she calls the sober matron And the sober matron was a party girl in her youth, and when she thinks back to her youth now, she kind of just feels completely different to that person. Like she can't understand how she cared about the things she cared about when she was 19, 20 years old, and she can't understand how she got into those things or how she was ever motivated by them. There's also another figure she calls the mortified matron, the same person except she looks back on her life and feels horrified by the person that she was and completely repudiates that person. Then there's the third example she gives, which is of what she calls the less serious matron, who looks back on her past and says, well, I'm in a different place in life now. I care about different things. I've got to get up at 7 o'clock to drive the kids to soccer practice. But yeah, it was fun. And yeah, I look back on that fondly. So these are different attitudes we can take to our past that have different evaluative dimensions to them. And to a certain extent, they involve some volatilizations of our sense of identity. Right? Is the serious matron or the mortified matron the same person anymore? Locke's answer was, look, you're the same person if you can extend your consciousness to a past or future event. Now, unfortunately, Locke doesn't tell us exactly what he means by that, and people have filled the gap with bad interpretations. But he means something like the extent to which you can become continuous with or connected to that past or future self. So if we can somehow extend our consciousness, say in recollection or in anticipation, to the past or future, that's what makes us the same self. I am that boy who fell off that pier because I can think back to it. And one of the good things about this account, at least, before we get to the problems with it, there are always problems. One of the good things about it is it makes sense of some of those intuitions we've just talked about. Agency across time, right? It doesn't make sense that I'm saving up leave to go on a big holiday at the end of the year, unless I think that it's me who's going to turn up for that holiday. Right? Rather than somebody with my name, my dress sense cavorting with my wife on a ship 6 months from now, wherever it's going to be. I want it to be me that turns up, not just somebody who looks and sounds like me and has the same name. I want it to be somebody with my psychology. It's also linked to forgiveness connected to psychological change. That is the way in which we say, well, you did a terrible thing, you bullied me at school or whatever, but look, it was like 20 years ago and you're a totally different person now, so I'm not going to hold it against you, right? Psychological change. Makes sense of that. Yes, you can extend your mind to it, but your psychology is very different. Temporal discounting over guilt. Again, it seems like, yeah, okay, you did a bad thing, but it was so long ago, it doesn't really matter anymore, right? And also, forgiveness for things done during things like psychotic episodes or other times when you're not yourself, as they say. As Locke puts it, Locke says, if it be possible for the same man to have distinct incommunicable consciousness at different times, it is past doubt the same man would at different times make different persons, which we see is the sense of mankind in the solemnest declaration of their opinions, human laws not punishing the madman for the sober man's actions, nor the sober man for what the madman did, thereby making them into two persons, which is somewhat explained by our way of speaking in English when we say such a one is not himself or is beside himself. Right, so we might say of someone, well, you're not morally responsible for that thing you did because you were not capable of moral competency at the time due to illness or some other kind of impairment. Now, as I say, Locke wasn't wonderfully clear what he meant by extension of consciousness, but everyone thought he was talking about memory. Right? They thought what he's saying is you're the same person as you were in the past because you remember what you did in the past. So this becomes the memory criterion of personal identity. Now, there are problems with this. One is that some people say the word memory already implies identity. If I say, I remember falling off a pier, that entails that I was there. If I say, I remember falling off a pier, but it wasn't me, that either makes no sense, or what I'm saying is I have a false memory of falling off a pier. Maybe. But it also creates a problem with transitivity, which I'll get to in a minute. But it created a more immediate problem, which is that Locke's account seems to imply that you're off the hook for any terrible thing you did, so long as you've forgotten it. Right? So if you've forgotten some terrible crime you committed, we can't punish you for it because you don't really remember it, and so you're not the same person who did it. Right. William Molyneux, the Irish philosopher, wrote to Locke and said, well, what about things we've done when we're sleepwalking or drunk, for instance? Surely we hold people accountable, maybe not sleepwalking, but surely we hold people accountable for things they do when they're drunk. To which Locke said, well, yes, we do hold people accountable for things they do when they're drunk because they got themselves drunk, right? But that's kind of a special case. Locke had to admit in his letters to Molyneux, yeah, sleepwalking, you kind of got me there. That's potentially a problem. Locke's answer to this problem, however, what do we do about the fact that people do bad things but then forget about them, is disarmingly simple. Kill them all and let God sort it out. That's a simplification, but only just. What he actually says is not a man drunk and sober the same person? Why else is he punished for the fact he commits when drunk, though he be never afterwards conscious of it? Just as much the same person as a man that walks and does other things in his sleep is the same person, and is answerable for any mischief he shall do in it. Human laws punish both, with a justice suitable to their way of knowledge, because in these cases they cannot distinguish certainly what is real and what counterfeit, and so the ignorance in drunkenness or sleep is not admitted as a plea. In other words, somebody says, yes, I did that terrible thing, but I was drunk or I was sleepwalking. Well, we're going to execute you for it anyway because you might be lying. But don't worry, because God will sort it all out on the day of judgment. Okay, you might say here, let's ditch all this talk of minds. It's waffly, they're hard to count, terrible movies about mind swaps. Let's just move on from all that and talk about brains, right? Brains are there, they're physical. They weigh like 3 kilos, you can pick them up, you can kick them around, whatever. Don't do that. Maybe the transplant intuition isn't really about minds. Maybe it's about brains. And Locke just thought it was about minds because he didn't know enough about brains. Maybe what we really care about is the identity of our brains. Maybe you are your brain.
We're with Patrick Stokes on the mystery of personal identity. Who are you exactly? The more you think about it, the less certain it might become. Recorded at the Ethics Centre in Sydney, and you're listening to it here on the Philosopher's Zone.
One way of thinking about that is, imagine if there was a brain transplant, where your brain could be taken out and put into the decerebrated skull of another person. I only said that because I like using the word decerebrated. You will never get to use that word unless you're talking about this stuff. Most of us have the intuition that the person who wakes up after the surgery is you in a different body. Your identity is gone with the brain. Is that purely because your brain is the bearer of your identity? Maybe. Well, here's an interesting problem, and this is the one that got Parfit sucked into philosophy when Wiggins gave the example. Imagine this. This is a slightly more elaborate version than Wiggins, but it does the same work. Bill and Bob are identical twins. They're both very, very sick, in fact, terminally sick, but in very different ways. Bob's brain is dying, but his body is healthy. Bill's body is dying, but his brain is healthy. So, what we do is we open up their heads, we take Bill's healthy brain, and we transplant it into Bob's healthy body. And we throw out Bill's body and Bob's brain, which are both beyond saving. So, who wakes up? Does Bill survive this surgery? I'll just get a quick show of hands. How many of you think, yes, Bill survives this surgery? Okay. How many of you think, no, Bill doesn't survive this surgery? Oh, okay, we're almost evenly split. How many of you think there's no real answer to this? You're way ahead of me. Both surviving? I mean, part of this is that we have this focus on brains as where thinking happens. And a lot of philosophers now are saying that that's wrong. We should think of thinking as something that bodies do, and in fact that bodies in their environment do. So my colleagues who consider themselves what are sometimes called triple E philosophers of mind, that is embodied and active and ecological. There's actually like 4 E's, but they choose 3 for some reason. They will tell you that in fact thinking is something your whole body does in its environment. When you use a calculator, thinking is not a thing happening in your brain. Thinking is actually a thing that's happening between your brain, your body, and the calculator. So it may be that, in fact, the focus on brains in this is problematic. There was an interesting case recently, actually, of a woman whose father had died, but his heart had been transplanted, and she went and found the recipient and said, "Can you walk me down the aisle at my wedding?" It's a lovely story. And again, my cynical, cold philosopher's heart's looking at that and going, there is no transfer of identity in this case. But it was a really lovely story and very emotional for everyone involved. And they only met on the day of the wedding too, so it's a really lovely thing. Okay, so there's at least some fairly strong intuition that many people have that in this scenario, Bill survives. Bob dies, Bill lives in Bob's body. Now imagine this. So I know there's a couple of medically trained people here tonight, so I'm going to get myself in trouble if I get this wrong, but the two hemispheres of your brain are connected in a couple of different ways. One of the main ways they're connected is by a thick band of tissue called the corpus callosum. In the 1950s, they started doing surgery for really severe cases of epilepsy where they would actually cut the corpus callosum so that seizures couldn't travel from one hemisphere to the other. Now, what they then found out was that it seemed like under certain experimental conditions you can show that when people have had that surgery, the two halves of the brain are more or less acting independently of each other. They appear to be almost separate centres of consciousness. I'm not going to go into it now, but there's some really fascinating and kind of freaky accounts of some of the things that they could bring up under experimental conditions. It's quite possible that some of that's now been debunked. I don't want to know if it has. But anyway, imagine if that's true anyway. I mean, it does appear to be, but just say it is for the sake of this argument too. Imagine if, instead of Bill and Bob, the twins, we now have Bill, Bob and Ben, who are identical triplets. And all three are sick, but in this case, Bob's brain and Ben's brain are dying, while Bill's body is dying. So in this case, we have one healthy brain and two healthy bodies. What do we do? Well, Bill's brain is removed, cut in half, and then each hemisphere is placed into the healthy bodies of Bob and Ben. Right? So the bodies of Bob and Ben get half a brain each, which is enough to sustain consciousness. Now, what happens to Bill in this scenario? Does Bill survive? It seems like, what are our options here? Yes, Bill survives. Well, hang on, which one of them's Bill then? Right, we've got two people walking around, each claiming to be Bill, each psychologically continuous with Bill. They each claim to remember what Bill remembers. They each wake up and go, hey, what's going on? Hi, I'm Bill, after the surgery. They come out of the anaesthetic brilliantly in this scenario. So they're psychologically continuous. But there's two of them. If identity is a strict numerical relationship, they can't be the same person. I won't go into the details, but basically it violates a thing called Leibniz's law, the identity of indiscernibles. So they can't be the same person because there's two of them, right? So Bill can't be both of them because there's two separate people. Is he neither of them? Well, that seems wrong too because they both claim to be Bill. But there's no grounds on which we can say one of them's Bill and the other one's not, short of flipping a coin. Right? There's no real difference between them psychologically. Right? This fission problem makes whether or not Bill survives seem utterly indecidable. Now, I recently wrote a very cheeky thing for the conversation about this, which was an ill-advisable thing I did late on a Friday night. You may have seen in the news that Vice President Mike Pence adheres to what's called the Billy Graham rule, which is that he refuses to have dinner alone with any woman other than his wife. Like his wife has to be present or another relative has to be there. Billy Graham instituted this as a way of basically keeping himself free of scandal, but Mike Pence has the same sort of rule. Now imagine that Mike Pence is having dinner with his wife when she suddenly splits in two like an amoeba. And suddenly there's two qualitatively identical Karen Pences sitting there. Does he have to leave the table? They can't both be his wife. So it seems like he is now having dinner with a woman who is not his wife, with two women who are not his wife, in fact. Cheeky. On the other hand, it seems like if he wants to say that one of them's his wife, but not the other one, he's got no principled grounds on which he can say that one's his wife, but not the other one. I published this, and then a philosopher friend of mine said, actually, there's no problem. His wife has ceased to exist, and therefore he's single and can have dinner with whoever he wants. So, yes, but it's a bit gross that he's, newly widowed and he's already dating again. Having said that, again, widowed sounds wrong, right? And this is an important point here. It seems like fission wouldn't be the same as death, right? It seems wrong to say in our example earlier that Bill dies just because there are now two people that are psychologically continuous with him. It doesn't seem to be anywhere near as bad as ordinary death. In some ways, it might even be slightly better than ordinary survival. You can get more stuff done. Likewise, teleportation, right? We all have seen as kids or whatever, many of us far too far into our adulthoods, watch shows like Star Trek or whatever, teleportation's a frequent plot device, right? People beam from one place to another and we just take it as read. that, oh yeah, that's the same person from one place to another. And yet what's happening is they're being disintegrated and a perfect replica of them is being created. Captain Kirk died over and over and over again and no one noticed. Everyone treated as if it's the same person the whole way through. Likewise, there was an episode of Doctor Who recently, which I won't spoil for you, but the implication seems to be that there have actually been billions of doctors. So what he's saying here, is this a form of transport or is it a form of suicide? Or is it somehow both, right? What a lot of this is pointing to is that it may be that strict numerical identity is not what we care about. Derek Parfit passed away earlier this year. That was his big finding. That in fact, what these examples like teleportation and fission show is that strict identity is not what we care about in survival. What do we care about? Well, we care about our ongoing continuity into the future, if you like. But that's not a deep fact, right? If I take away 50% of your memories and put in someone else's memories, are you the same person or not? What if I take 51%, 52%, 30%? There's no clear point at which you go from being one person to the other person. In his example, if I give you Napoleon's memories. If I give you 20% of Napoleon's memories, you might say you're the same person. If I give you 80% of Napoleon's memories, you might say you're now a different person. But there's no clear threshold point. And that was Parfit's point. There's no deep fact. There's just forms of psychological continuity, forms of physical continuity, but there's no deep further fact about whether it's you or me or anyone else. And Parfit reported, in a very famous passage in Reasons and Persons, finding that liberating. He says, before he realised the truth of this form of it's a form of reductionism, reduces personal facts to subpersonal facts. He says, before I realised this, he said, my life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared, and I now live in the open air. Well, he doesn't anymore. He also reported, as a result of this, less fear of death, right? If there's no deep fact about you being dead and other people being alive, then suddenly death doesn't seem so bad. And more compassion to others. He said, if there's no deep fact about you being you and me being me, then why should I care about my own suffering more? Or as Godwin said, what magic is there in the pronoun my? He wasn't the first person to think of that. That's what the Buddhists were telling us over 2,500 years ago. The Questions of King Milinda, it's a classic Buddhist text. Teleporting monks. That should be enough of a reason to read it. It opens with teleporting monks. But it also involves some very famous passages, one of which is the chariot passage, where Nagasena says, look, if I take a chariot, what is the chariot? Is it the individual parts? No. A wheel is not a chariot. A stirrup is not a chariot. Is it all the parts put together? No. Is it the pattern of the parts? No. If you take the chariot apart, you're left with a whole pile of chariot parts, but there's not the chariot left over, floating in midair, so to speak. So he says chariot is a mere designation, and chariots are only conventionally real. And that, according to at least some forms of Buddhism, is what selves are. Selves are only conventionally real. You're only you by convention. Really, there's just a whole bunch of psychological and physical facts that just more or less continue into the future. So if identity is not what we care about, I'm not entirely sure Parfit's right about that, but leave that aside for now. If identity is not what we care about, what is it that we do care about in identity? Maria Scheckman says that what we care about in identity is what she calls the 4 features. Survival, as illustrated by Bear Grylls. Moral responsibility, what you are and are not answerable for. Certainly Locke was driven by that. So were those early church fathers we looked at. Self-interested concern. I don't want to go to the dentist tomorrow. I'd rather find out that you have to go to the dentist tomorrow. No offence. And compensation. I want it to be me who goes on the holiday 6 months from now, not somebody who looks like me. Right. So these are the sort of things we care about in identity. Our ongoing survival, not dying, getting our just desserts, making sure other people get their just desserts or don't get unjustly punished for something they didn't do, and just compensation as well. So that takes us from some of these kind of arcane metaphysical points through to more a question about practical identity. The sort of practical concerns and worries that structure how you put your life together, so to speak. As I say, Maria Scheckman there is a key figure in this, contemporary American philosopher. Absolutely delightful person, I have to say too, Maria. She's really lovely. She says what we're moving from here is those sort of abstract philosopher questions about what makes person X at time t1 and person Y at time t2 the same person. A question about re-identification. How do you re-identify persons? But a question about characterization. Which characteristics are truly those of some person? And we do make those judgments all the time. That's not really you. You shouldn't do that. That was very out of character. I'm no longer that guy. Right? We make those kinds of characterization questions or judgments about personal identity all the time. And they're really central to how we live our lives. I'm going to ask you another question. Short as you can, what's your life story? If you had to do it in like 2 sentences, 3 sentences. You want to have a crack?
I came here and trying to figure it out.
Excellent.
Creation.
Okay. That's...
5 children.
Okay. Oh, okay.
A company, dreams.
Excellent. Good. Heidegger, in his lectures on Aristotle, famously got rid of the biography stuff at the front by saying, of Aristotle, a man, all we need to know is he was born, he worked, and he died. Most of us would probably tell our life story with a bit more heft than that. We might pick on things like creation. Yep.
Just one long existential crisis.
You sound like fun. Awesome. Okay, good. You've come to the right place. Sure. So, if you're going to tell the story of your life, like if somebody says to you at a party, tell me your life story, right? You're going to do like what you just did then. You're going to pick out key sort of island events, right? The ones that are kind of involve the most meaning to the overall structure, right? It's not going to be, oh, and I saw 3 seagulls one time, or something really dull or boring like that, right? You're going to edit your story. You're going to tell the events that seem to have the most significance for that story, and you're going to leave the other stuff out. You're not going to tell me what you had for breakfast every day. And in fact, if you did put all that detail in, it wouldn't even be a story. It would be incoherent. A story that involves every little bit of detail is not a story. It's just incoherent. It's unintelligible. Imagine if Shakespeare writes Hamlet describing every time every single person breathes in and out, or something like that, or every single movement that someone makes, or what every character does when they're off stage. It wouldn't be a story anymore. Stories are kind of like jazz. It's the stuff you leave out that structures and makes the story. In the same way with jazz, they say it's the notes you don't play. I don't know. I'm no good at jazz. But this is the interesting thing about telling your life story, telling who you are, right? You start narrating. You start putting your life into narrative forms. When I asked people what their first memories were earlier, some people started telling the story of those events. I did that too when I told my first story. When I was 4 years old, I was fishing with my dad and I fell off a pier, right? That embeds the whole thing in a story that makes it intelligible, right? Not just green, bubbles, cold, but a story that makes sense of the whole thing, that makes it intelligible. Sheckman in particular is a proponent of this view called the narrative identity view. This is a really big thing from the 80s and 90s. It's still around. There's still a lot of narrative proponents, but it's become a more complicated and nuanced position now, I think. But it's the idea that what you fundamentally are is a story. Yourself is a story you're telling about yourself to try and make sense of all this stuff that happens. You unify your life across time by narrative. What makes me the same as that kid that fell off the pier? The fact that I can tell a story. The fact that I can tell a story that links me to that kid. A story that can be checked by other people, right? So they can't say, no, that's impossible. For instance, I hope she won't mind me telling this story, but my wife insists that she remembers when Cyclone Tracy happened. My wife was born 3 years after Cyclone Tracy happened. What she remembers, we had this discussion. I said, no, you were born like 3 years after Cyclone Tracy. You can't remember Cyclone Tracy. What you remember is the 1984 mini-series about Cyclone Tracy. Right? But again, it's narrative that's doing the work here, right? And mutually correcting each other's narratives. Alistair McIntyre puts it, we are only ever the co-authors of our lives. Yes, we tell a narrative. Yes, we're centrally involved in spinning that narrative, making our lives intelligible and making the arc of our lives intelligible. But we're only ever co-authors, right? Other people, if you like, write into our story. They start by giving us a name. They start by giving us a set of meanings that we belong to. And of course, a story is not just a chronicle. It's not just a series of events. right? Then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It leaves details out, it focuses on the big meanings, and it has a shape. Stories have to have a shape. Roughly, a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? If they don't have that shape, they become unintelligible, right? They have to start somewhere and finish somewhere to have an overall shape, an overall trajectory. And one of the key objections to this narrative identity stuff, of course, is that human life is messy. It's full of details that don't make sense, that don't go anywhere. It's full of random bits and pieces, right? There's always this objection to what we're doing is overlaying a kind of meaningful structure that's like literary narratives that isn't really true to our lives. And yet it also seems like we need to do something like that. We need to narrate to make sense of life at all. If you don't narrate, then everything just sort of falls apart. And again, you find this in figures as diverse as MacIntyre, Paul Ricoeur, French philosopher of the 20th century, and Daniel Dennett, who's a very sort of reductionist philosopher who says that the self is a centre of narrative gravity, as he puts it. It's a fiction that the brain tells about itself. Of course, you might also say, well, hang on, if I'm a story, who's telling the story? Does that mean I'm a story telling a story about a story? It doesn't seem right. It seems there needs to be a narrator for the story who can't be identical with the story. So what a few of us who have been critical of this narrative identity stuff have said is, well, narrative's important, but it can't be the full story, no pun intended, about selfhood, because you also have to be the person telling the story. Death is an issue for this too. I mean, death's an issue for pretty much everything, but death is very much an issue for this narrative stuff too. If I think my life has a certain kind of meaning to it or trajectory to it, and then suddenly I die in a random accident, it seems like the meaning of my story has been completely different to what I think it might be. Equally, there can be things that happen after my death that might be integral to the story of my life. William Roebling built the Brooklyn Bridge. He didn't live to see it finished, but the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge seems to be a part of his life story, even though he was dead by this time and his son had finished building it. Now, another thought experiment. Stealing this one from Frederick Kaufman. It's all stolen, everything's stolen. Imagine that you'd been swapped as a baby with a child from an Inuit village in Alaska. If you'd grown up in that Inuit village, instead of where you did, would you still be you? Or would you be someone else?
I think you would still be you.
Mm-hmm.
As a kid, you didn't have any sense of self.
Yep.
This random skipping pull up.
Sure, yeah.
That's just me.
Yeah, sure. So it seems like your practical identity is built up by a lot of your experiences, which seems to make it seem like it almost wouldn't be me in that way. But I mean, see, this is a tricky thing between numerical identity and practical identity, right?
Be I, but different.
Sorry? Yeah?
I'm I, but I'm different.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so Kaufman, in his discussion of this, says, look, that person would be like a stranger to me. I'd wish them well, but they wouldn't mean anything more to me than any other stranger means. You know, having grown up in that Inuit village, I wouldn't be at all psychologically similar to that person. Anyone want to defend the idea you would definitely be the same person?
The same.
The same, yeah.
Yeah, because the narrative includes all of that. The narrative is ongoing.
Okay.
The storyteller's telling the story now.
Mm-hmm.
So up until now, it includes that.
Okay. So,
There are no two persons. The person that now looks at the person who had been, if that had happened differently, there's only one person. And it's just a different one.
yeah. So, okay, so we could say there's only one person possible, and it's either going to be an Inuit or whatever we are. Yeah. So, possibly, I mean, there's interestingly different intuitions on this, right? So Kaufman's intuition is, if I'd been born in an Inuit village, I would be a completely different person. I would have none of the psychology I have. I'd be thinking in a different language. I'd have totally different experiences. I would probably have a very different personality.
That's a different question. That's only different.
No other person. He's comparing
Mm-hmm.
with or she.
Yeah,
Comparing it to a non-existent cipher.
Sure.
That's easy, but I agree with that.
Yeah. This is the countervailing intuition here, and I can't remember who does this, I'm sorry, but somebody gave this really interesting objection to this, which is, imagine if you find out on your 40th birthday that when you were born, somebody snuck into the hospital and tried to steal you, to ship you off to an Inuit village, right? But they've caught the person just in time and gave you back to your parents, right? Most of us would respond by saying, oh wow, I very nearly had a very, very different life, right? Most of us wouldn't have responded by saying, wow, I very nearly didn't exist, right? We assume it to be us, just us growing up in an Inuit village. So different sets of intuitions about the relationship between identity and personality. On the other hand, it seems like you could be raised in a different time and place such that the person that you would have been, to you, looks not just like a total stranger, but somebody horrible, somebody you wouldn't want to be, somebody you disavow identity with.
But who's you? Asking that.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, okay, imagine that I find out that I'd been nearly kidnapped by somebody who was going to take me and raise me as a Nazi, right? And going to make me the most horrific, irredeemable racist, right? I might look at that and think, wow, if it was a choice between dying and that, maybe I'd be better off dead, possibly. So there it seems like, in fact, that person is so radically different to me that I would forego survival rather than be that person. But it's right that we're getting hung up on this because this is where these intuitions start to diverge, right? Between numerical identity and practical identity, between psychology and so forth. And a lot of this feeds into the contemporary debate over identity politics, right? Now, identity politics is one of those terms that, you know, is kind of used more or less as an all-purpose term of abuse in some quarters, but it does actually have some kind of substantive meaning to it. The idea being that how you experience the world and the sort of person you are is structured by where you sit in a set of cultural and political and historical meanings, if you like, that you don't choose. So it's a kind of politics that focuses on socio-cultural identity, not numerical identity, not even, well, sort of practical identity, but the sort of identity you have by virtue of being born into a set of racialized, genderized meanings, or being born into a particular sexual identity and so forth. And there's all these power relations that are built into those identities, right? If you're born into one of those identities, you're born into a particular set of power relations, is the idea. Of course, that's contrasted with this idea that says, look, we're all people, we're all human, we're all equal, and so don't focus on the differences. Don't focus on the things that divide us, but focus instead on the things that unite us. Focus on the similarities we have as people. And what's interesting about this is this cuts across left and right. Right? So you have people on the left who say, oh, there's something divisive about this identity politics stuff, it's terrible. You've also got people on the right who actually adopt, even though the right tends to be opposed to identity politics, you've got people that adopt forms of identity politics. A lot of contemporary ethno-nationalism, the sort of alt-right people, a lot of them are actually taking on board identity politics structures and tropes. Right? So you've got this interesting disagreement between identity as this socio-politically constructed thing that to a certain extent determines the sort of person that you are, and identity as everyone as a kind of free locus of consciousness, you might say. Now, it tracks a distinction, I think. This is me being speculative here. You're getting pure Stokes here. It tracks a distinction that I think is actually a really important one. The distinction between what you are as a self and what you are as a person. And I think a lot of these disagreements, a lot of these different diverging intuitions, and a lot of the discussion of the disagreement between identity politics and a kind of liberal universalism, to a certain extent come down to this distinction, right? So each of us is a person. We're a thing that exists across time. It has a body, it has a psychological continuity, it has a narrative we can tell about it, and that other people can tell about it. Other people can tell your life story. Maybe not in as much detail. You might think they'll get bits of it wrong, but they can still tell your life story. That's what biographers do. And it's also something that is diachronic. That is, it exists across time, right? So there's a story about me and a 4-year-old falling off a pier, and there's a story that connects those two, and it's intrinsically diachronic. And somebody else could tell that story as well as I could, potentially. But on the other hand, each of us is also something else, where that first-person perspective that doesn't seem to fit into the third-personal universe. We exist in the moment, here and now. You're the self looking out on the world right now, sitting in this room, looking at me talking, wishing I'd shut up. The subject of the experience. You're having an experience right now, and there's somebody that is having that experience, or that's figured as the experiencer of that experience. That's the self that we're talking about. As we've seen, philosophers disagree on whether there is such a thing, but it seems like we can at least make sense of that we are both persons, objects that exist in time, and selves, present tense, first-person perspectives on the world. view you third personally, and you look very much like an object among other objects, controlled by causal forces, right? Otherwise, marketing wouldn't work. Otherwise, psychology wouldn't work. If there wasn't a cause and effect relationship between the stimuli you're presented with and the way you behave, then these things just wouldn't work. So that's how science studies you, third personally. But you're also, first personally, we experience ourselves as free, unconstrained, rational beings. The self that looks out in the world and thinks, I'm here, what do I do now? I'm having this experience. And it could be, I haven't fully worked this out yet, but it could be, that clash between identity politics and liberal universalism is really a clash between those two ways of coming at people, between seeing ourselves as these socially determined, constricted, third-personal objects, which we are, and seeing ourselves as these free, rational agents, which, not about the rational so much, but which we are as well. What we are subjectively and what we are objectively. And these two things, as the stunningly ugly Jean-Paul Sartre put it, never coincide. Like the eye that never sees itself, as Wittgenstein put it. Wittgenstein clearly never had eye floaters, I can tell you the eye can see itself. Like the eye that never sees itself, the self, if you like, never coincides with itself. If I ask you to reflect on yourself, what kind of person are you, right? You make yourself an object for yourself, right? And by making yourself an object to yourself, you've already kind of gone beyond yourself. You're not the thing. You are the eye that sees as well as the thing that it's looking at. So you've kind of gone beyond yourself in that way. You don't coincide. So it seems like, yes, we are our social identities, but we are also already beyond them. We both are constrained by them and transcend them. We're intrinsically dual. We're conflicted in that way. Final question for you tonight, because I'm conscious we're running out of time. Are you afraid of death? It is the final question, yes. Are you, well, it's the penultimate question, actually. It's probably, yeah. Are you afraid of death? No? What is wrong with you people? I am terrified of death. Absolutely terrified of it. And thinking and writing about it doesn't help, I can tell you that now. Really? Awesome, we might have a chat later. I mean, that's interesting. This is an interesting question. Why do people fear death? What is it about death that we fear? Right? Now, Mark Johnson, I mentioned earlier, said we've got at least two ways of fearing death. Right? We can fear the idea that there's not going to be someone with my name to look after my kids and, you know, feed my goldfish, descending order of priority, and write my books and all that sort of stuff. Right? We might fear there's no one there to do the practical things we care about. But there's also another way we fear death, which is we fear that there won't be anything it's like to be me anymore. That this, what Johnson calls arena of presence and action, this thing that's looking out in the world won't be there anymore. There are two different ways of fearing death. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. So we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for a really wonderful discussion. I enjoyed that enormously. Thank you.
And you've said a lot. A marvellous presentation by Patrick Stokes, Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at Deakin University, on the ethics of identity, recorded at the Ethics Centre in Sydney. And if you want more on identity, the latest episode of The Spirit of Things is worth a listen. Download it from our site or the new ABC Listen app, or the usual place you go to for your pods. Thanks today to Diane Dean and Mark Don. I'm Joe Gilanisi. See you again in the Philosopher's Zone.